this is Peter Hammond in the studio for From the Frontline. Tonight we've got researcher Emma Vaughan-Jones from the Morton Stanley School of Christian Journalism, and we will be discussing the 9 stages of genocide identified by the International Association of Genocide Scholars and where South Africa is in the process. The title for tonight is Resisting Genocide in South Africa. Welcome, Emma.
Hi there.
So, Emma, the word genocide's been thrown around a lot. What do we mean by genocide? What's the definition?
Well, according to the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the definition is that it's any act committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group by any means, by killing members of the group, by causing serious body harm or mental harm, by deliberately inflicting life conditions on the group that will bring about physical destruction. It may also be preventing births within the group or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
Right. So this word genocide, actually the etymology, it began with the Turkish genocide of the Armenian Christians in 1915, so just over 100 years ago, and we dealt with the Turkish genocide of the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek Orthodox Christians in an earlier session on From the Frontline. But tonight we're particularly thinking of the genocide targeting of Afrikaners in South Africa, particularly the farmers, but it's more than that, because we've got highly irresponsible, inflammatory politicians like Julius Malema saying, we're not calling for the slaughtering of all white people at this time.
Just yet.
Yeah, which is extremely irresponsible, and this at a time that farmers are actually being murdered. And we're going to want to break this down. So you've done a study, 9 Stages of Genocide, which has been uploaded on the Morton Stanley School of Christian Journalism website. So what are the 9 stages? We talk about 9 stages or operational processes. What are they?
Okay, so the first stage is classification, the second is symbolization, the third is discrimination, the fourth is dehumanization, the fifth is organization, the sixth is polarization, the seventh is preparation, the eighth is extermination, and the final one, the 9th, is denial.
Okay, let's break this down in. Number 1, classification. How do we understand that? What's involved in classification?
Okay, well, subconsciously, we distinguish and classify objects all the time. Even as infants, we naturally assimilate new information about unknown items and incorporate that new information into existing broad categories containing other items with similar characteristics. All cultures require classification of the natural and social world. Cultures continuously tend to distinguish between us and them. People categorize according to nationality, religion, ethnicity, race, language, intelligence. None of these are wrong, but the problem occurs when there's no respect for these differences and for the people, for their private property, and for the well-being of others within the divergent groups. And in fact, we can see this in South Africa today as it's greatly divided, and whatever the category may be defined by, race, poverty, demographics, there is this separation within South Africa. And under the apartheid regime, we could see this, but was there a respect for life? Was there a respect for property? And was there a well-being of the other group respected? And today, there is also a discrimination, but by the ANC government, for their political agendas, are we now noticing a respect for life, for property, for well-being? Is this being encouraged today?
Not really. In fact, it's extremely disturbing that the new South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, he said, we are going to take farms away from the whites and give them to our people. Now, as president, you would think he's speaking for all South Africans, but apparently the white South Africans are no longer our people. And so right there you can see classification, how he's speaking about, we're going to take the farms away from the whites and give them to our people. Now, for a president to talk like that, to suddenly, in a sense, take away the citizenship rights and the right before the law to property, just for starters, to think that without it's bad enough to take away people's property, but without compensation. These farmers, of course, didn't just get the land, they didn't steal the land, they hacked the land out of the wilderness. I mean, just take, for example, Franschhoek used to be Olifantshoek. They're the French Huguenot refugees fleeing persecution in Europe, came here for religious freedom. They weren't even given the wilderness. They were sold it, and it took them generations to pay for it to the Dutch East India Company. And they were given nothing but wilderness, and there in Olifantshoek there was thorn bushes and everything from rhinos, leopards, elephants, and they had to hack out of the wilderness. Even the shovels and the picks that they used were sold by the Dutch East India Company, which they had to pay for many years later. So they got nothing free. They didn't steal a thing. And so all the farms around South Africa, some in the most arid territory, they were hacked out of the wilderness. So for a person to speak about taking land without compensation, but these people have put generations of hard work to produce the buildings, the wells, the dams, and the vineyards and whatever else is on these lands. So it's extremely disturbing when you classify people so that they no longer are your people.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, symbolization. What's meant by that?
So classification and symbolization are natural human processes, and on their own they don't lead to genocide, but it's when they lead to discrimination and dehumanization, and when they are coupled with blind hatred that they become perilous. For example, as you were saying just now, Dr. Hammond, in Ottoman Turkey, Christians were isolated and marginalized. They wore crosses instead of Muslim attire, so they were easily distinguished. They had that symbol, and because of that they were then disparaged. And in South Africa now we can see that the color of your skin alone is used to distinguish the group to be destroyed, and regardless of your wealth or property or poverty, regardless of your age, regardless of your intelligence or nationality, regardless of your life of service and sacrifice for the country, in South Africa, the color of your skin tone alone can be a matter of life and death.
It certainly can. Yes. Okay. That's symbolization. The next one, discrimination's pretty close.
So discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people based on race or age or religion. This is aggravated when a majority group dominates and uses laws and political power to deny the rights of the minority group. For example, the minority group is given limited civil rights or even citizenship, like communities in the Soviet Union prohibited education for Christians. Discrimination...
She actually had to be a member of the Communist Party to get to higher education.
Yeah, can you believe that? Discrimination on the basis of race was prevalent during apartheid. Blacks, coloureds and Indians were only allowed in certain areas, and they were prohibited from other areas. But in their allocated living areas, they were looked after. They were provided with electricity, running water, education, medical facilities, etc. Luxuries that hundreds of thousands of South Africans today don't have.
Indeed. In fact, you can see that some people have said, well, this is reverse apartheid, what we're seeing in South Africa today, but that's not exactly true, because reverse apartheid would mean that the government, the ANC government, would be giving whites their own areas, their own homelands, and in fact funding them, building everything from football stadiums, sports centres, hospitals, schools and so on, and providing huge budgets, which of course nobody wants, or at least I don't know any whites in South Africa requiring that. But the discrimination in the past was discrimination, yes, but they were also providing a lot of their needs and more.
Yes. Whereas now entire families are being murdered and mutilated daily on the basis of their skin color and their language. What's more scary is that often they're being murdered by people who are so-called born free. A lot of these farm murderers didn't even live through the times of apartheid, and so it's terrifying to think of where this hatred is actually even coming from. It's being taught to them by our very own government. Many black South Africans, they are upset that they are still living in poverty.
And so they should be.
For sure. But why is it that South Africans are still living like this? The government is just not fulfilling any of the promises that they've given of a brighter future. And rather than actually looking after the people, the leaders of our government are too busy enriching themselves and blaming the poverty on the white man. And 2 Peter 2:19 accurately depicts the deceit of the ANC politicians. And it says, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption.
I think this is getting to the heart of it, because a lot of this is actually a cover, a smokescreen to enable the politicians to get away with looting the country and failing to do what they're meant to do.
Very
Because
much
according
so.
to the African Union said that a full quarter, 25% of the gross domestic product of Africa is stolen by government corruption every single year. Now that is 10 times all the foreign aid that Africa receives is stolen by governments alone. We're not talking about the other theft. The other theft's bad enough, but just government corruption alone. Now, if you take South Africa, our national budget is 4 trillion rand. More than 1.1 trillion rand is stolen by our government by corruption every year. Officially, 1.1 trillion.
That's atrocious.
And so when the poor people on the ground justly say, why don't we have electricity or water? And why don't we have proper roads and so on, sanitation and so on? And of course the answer is because your government's stolen it. But instead, they can distract the people saying, it's the white people's fault. Now, isn't that convenient? It's Jan van Riebeck's fault. Oh, it's Cecil Rhodes' statue's fault. If we could just get rid of a statue of someone who died 100 years ago, this will solve your problems. And there's a continual ongoing crisis. And what you see is continually distracting people by having a scapegoat who just happens to be different from us. They've got a different skin color and so on. And they're to blame for all your problems. But of course, the minority can't be to blame for the problems of the majority, especially when the majority run the government or should run the government. So actually what we are seeing is they're promising liberty while they themselves are slaves of corruption. What 2 Peter 2:19 says, very, very appropriate. Okay, so we've looked at classification, symbolization, discrimination. What comes next?
The fourth stage is dehumanization, and this is depriving a person or a group of people of positive human qualities. It's diminishing them by likening them to animals or diseases, to pests or parasites, such as in the Rwandan Holocaust, where the minority group of Tutsis was called cockroaches.
Inyensis.
Yeah.
Cockroaches, quite right.
And as soon as a people group is perceived as less human, it becomes easier for the dominant group to exterminate them. So denying others of their humanity pardons their murder, and therefore victims are often butchered and mutilated to express this denial. In South Africa, we can see the farmers and their families are having their eyes gouged out, electrical drills and angle grinders used on them, joker smiles being cut into their faces. During this stage of genocide, hate propaganda is spread in media, newspapers and radios, to portray the terrorists as victims and portray the actual victims instead as the villains. So while white people are still being blamed, as we were just saying now, for the oppression, but according to the South African Union, like we just said,
The African Union, yes.
the African Union, a trillion rand is stolen a year through corruption, which is just appalling. But we can see that the Lord knew that this deceit would cause disaster, and Isaiah 5 verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man."
Okay, so the dehumanization is making a scapegoat of a group, normally a minority, obviously, who's identifiably different, and making them responsible. And they're not only the scapegoat, but they serve as a smokescreen behind which the criminals run the country, loot the country. So basically this is a cover for colossal theft. And if the average person on the street who's protesting about, we want decent housing, we want jobs, we want land, we want whatever, that they would be able to get it if the government was doing their job. Because isn't it true that the government itself is sitting on 4,323 farms that they already took from white farmers that they haven't never transferred to black owners? So they've got thousands of farms owned by the government. In fact, the government owns more land than all the white farmers anyway. And yet, what have they done with that? So when they're getting the people to get whipped up out the land, it's distracting people about the fact that the government's done nothing with what they've got anyway to help the people in need.
Yes, yeah. Isn't that appalling?
So dehumanization is actually part of making a scapegoat as a distraction from your own crime, so you can continue looting the country.
Exactly, just like how we're discussing now, and then based on the symbolization of their skin color.
So if the people on the streets who are supporting the EFF and others and the ANC, if they were to really understand the situation, they'd probably change the direction of attack to the ones who are organising them and say, wait a minute, you're the ones who are using us as cannon fodder for your corruption, and we actually are being had. We're being used.
By keeping them uneducated and in the dark, they are easy to be brainwashed into believing the lies that they are being told, and not seeing that they are in fact the problem here, and they are just blaming the white people.
Now, the reason why the government can get away with this is in South Africa, SATV, SABC, the main radio and TV broadcasts, are actually owned and controlled by the ANC government, are they not?
Yes, yeah.
And so you've already got a huge amount of media, plus the state schools' curriculums are again organised by the government. So here you've got two major forms of media, both the textbooks in the schools, the curriculums, and the national broadcasters, SABC, SATV, are telling the people a whole lot of things to distract them from what the government's really doing, which is not the job, but corruption, stealing from everyone. Trillions of rands so far, every single year they've been in power. So we're talking about already something in the region of over 24 trillion rand stolen from the country by the government. Not only stolen in terms of the budget, but there's also a lot of things that have broken down and property that have got destroyed. So in fact, the bill is even bigger than that, not to mention the cost of lives. So if people were to actually understand what's going on, they would actually be protesting against the government itself, not against
100%.
the minority who actually aren't to blame for their dilemma.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so we've got through the classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, and number 5 is?
Organization. So the 5th one is organization, and as Dr. Gregory Stanton, who is a professor at Mary Washington University and is also the vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, he says that genocide cannot be committed by an individual or a small group, but rather it takes the cooperation of a large number of people and the state. And he goes on to say that the genocidal process starts with prejudice and it just continues to go from there. So organization doesn't just happen, genocide doesn't just happen by accident. It is organized, it is premeditated, and occasionally it's organized by a terrorist group, but most of the time it is planned by the state.
Well, when the terrorist group became the state, then that's kind of understandable. As in the case of the MRND, who ran the state in Rwanda for the genocide in 1994, or the Young Turks, a radical group that took control of the Ottoman Empire and organized this whole jihad to wipe out the Christians in Ottoman Turkey in 1915. And of course, we've seen this in other places, like where the Khmer Rouge terrorist group, communist terrorist group under Pol Pot in Cambodia, managed to come to power, and they wiped out 40% of the population of Cambodia, all intelligentsia in that particular case. If you had been a school teacher, or if you wore glasses, or if your hands weren't calloused, then they assumed that you were the bourgeoisie and you were targeted for genocide in the killing fields of Rwanda, or of Cambodia in that case. So organization is when the state starts to organize a portion of the population to wipe out a minority.
Yes, yeah. But just as you brought up all those other examples now, isn't it tragic that we don't learn from these lessons in history? The world hears about these genocides and says never again, yet it happens again, and never again, yet it happens again, and if we're not careful, it's about to happen again.
Yes.
But yes, so organization. Soldiers are often specially trained and armed in order to execute the genocidal murders, and even though genocide is planned, the actual killings are often primal. So, for example, hoe blades to the back of the neck in Cambodia, as you were just talking about. And in Rwanda, they were butchered by machetes.
More people died with machetes in Rwanda in 6 weeks than have died from nuclear weapons in all of history. I mean, just think about that.
Can you believe that? Sure.
Talk about low-tech genocide.
Yeah, very brutal. So force is then often used to gain participants, and group hysteria is whipped up and spread through propaganda and media to overcome or prevent individual resistance. And in South Africa now, we have many racist and Marxist groups like the ANC, EFF, Black Land First, who are spreading hate speech and training their followers to detest and want to kill whites. Genocidal leaders promise utopia and advocate these atrocities in order to achieve the dream, but in the end, the only ones to actually benefit are those handful of leaders.
Yeah, and of course they're singing songs like, and I've heard them sing, as far back as 1993, one settler, one bullet. Kill the Boer, kill the farmer, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, and then we backwards and forwards, kill the Boer, kill the farmer. And they'll even be having them dancing and then shouting, Baba, Baba, for making the sound of shooting. And kill the Boer, kill the farmer. I've also heard them singing, one minister, one bullet, bomb the church, one bomb. And so this whole attitude of hating farmers and sing about it would be bad enough if it wasn't for the fact that the farmers are being murdered at the same time as they're singing about it.
Yes, yeah. And you say that you heard that as far back as 93, while Mandela was promising that never, never again will any South African be discriminated against by the basis of their race.
Wow. Okay, we are on number 5. So classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, and what comes in number 6?
Number 6 is polarization. So after these stages, genocide continues in a downward spiral of blood until it reaches a pool of mass murder. And hate groups continue to reinforce abhorrence by broadcasting lies and propaganda and intimidating their victims into silence. Massacres can then be directed to polarize the groups even further until settlement cannot be negotiated. So polarization is mainly trying to separate the groups more drastically. And the greedy, incompetent, and narrow-minded political leaders of our country are polarizing our country through deceit and through incendiary hate speech. And this has destroyed South Africa's dream of peace and of a rainbow nation.
Yes, for example, this business that all the whites have stolen the land. All whites are murderers, rapists, and thieves. Now, says who? The people who actually are promoting murder, rape, and stealing. And it's extraordinary how you can have these radical, irresponsible terrorist leaders who are themselves, all of them, I mean, from Julius Malema onwards and the previous president, Jacob Zuma, who were singing, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, bring me my machine gun, all this sort of highly irresponsible business. And they've got how many hundreds of charges of corruption against them? And not to mention rape charges and theft. And what are they stealing? In many cases, they're stealing from the poorest of the poor. So it's just extraordinary how the person who's pointing a finger at someone else, they've got, 3 or 4 fingers pointed back at themselves. So, yes, the polarization, the us or them, the fact that we could have a president who speaks about, we're going to take white land and give it to our people. I mean, talk about polarization.
Yeah, great.
So it doesn't matter what this white person's done. It doesn't matter what that black person's done or not done. Whites aren't our people. Blacks are our people. In fact, I remember at a communist meeting where they were talking about government by the people. So I said, well, I'm one of the people too. And they said, no, you're not. You're not one of the people. I said, well, who are the people? He said, members of the party are the people. And so when they say the people, don't think they're talking about you and I. They're talking about members of the Communist Party. Only members of the Communist Party are people by their definition.
That's
serious
atrocious.
polarization.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so we are up to number 7. There's
Great.
classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, and then we come to number 7.
Number 7 is preparation. Dr. Gregory Stanton, who we spoke about earlier, states that preparation often includes expropriation of the victim's property.
Yeah.
And often victims are concentrated or herded into a specific area or region. The leaders indoctrinate the nation with a fear or hatred of the victim group. And we can see this. The ANC, EFF, Black Land First, even the DA are all political parties who are currently vigorously preparing. They are in the process of trying to accomplish land reform and land expropriation, even in some cases without compensation. They are meticulously planning the removal of white people, and they are starting with the farmers. This is a masquerade for theft, for murder, and for violence, all under the guise of liberation.
Yes, freedom, liberation, peace. I mean, they use all kinds of terms that they don't mean what you and I would mean by those words at all, or what the dictionary says. And of course, what many people are missing is the fact that all of the threats and the hatred and the violence that's already happened up till now has led many, many, many whites to leave the country. In fact, more white South Africans are living outside of South Africa now than living in it. So we've already got millions have left. Of course, thousands have been killed. According to the most recent statistics I've heard, there's something in the region of 650,000 people have been murdered in South Africa since 1994, since Mandela became president. Of that 650,000 South Africans murdered, that includes over 80,000 white South Africans have been murdered. And of that, something like 4,000 farmers and their family members have been murdered since 1994. So a lot of the preparation has led to actual deaths already, which is also part of preparation because there's less and less people who can resist.
For sure, 100%. But just on that note, the murder rate between 1948 and 1989 was 170 people per year. Now, we're now sitting on more farmers than that per year, but the murder rate in general of the country was 170 per year. Whereas now, just last year, we had 19,000 murders, which is probably more than 52 murders a day here in South Africa now.
Yes, I mean,
these are stats released by the South African Police Force.
Yes, and in fact, we know that Interpol accused the South African government stats of being half the actual numbers. In fact, Interpol worked out that they were estimating that our death toll was close to 35,000 a year, and the South African Institute for Race Relations put it even higher than that, in the 40,000s. And I believe, based on the South African Medical Association, the South African Medical Association calculated in a year when we officially had something like 20,000 murders, they put 50,000, because talking about at the hospital end of dealing with people in morgues and so on, coming in knife wounds, stab wounds, shot so on, bludgeoned. And so we had a serious discrepancy where both the Southern Institute of Race Relations, Interpol, and the South African Medical Association all found the South African government statistics to be drastically lower than the actual on-the-ground murder statistics that they were recording. So just taking the government stats, it's bad enough. It's horrific. In fact, it's more people than die in the average war.
100%.
And this is meant to be peace. So we come to number 8. What's the 8th step in this process of genocide?
The 8th phase is extermination. And as the victims are demonized and not considered human, their deaths are not even considered murder. Even in the Rwandan genocide, murder was called work or clearing the bush. So men and women and children are slaughtered, and they're buried in a mass grave or burnt in a heap like rubbish. And the savagery of the occurring farm murders is appalling. It's not a matter of property or rights, but rather a hatred that has been entrenched deeply within these people through many years of endless lies and hate mongering. And this is evident because in 33% of the farm attacks, nothing is stolen in 33%. So it's purely malice. The single aim seems to be to inflict as much excruciating pain as possible.
Well, yes, and we don't want to get into the hideous details, but we're talking about not just murdering, we're talking about torturing death, sometimes over many hours, sometimes over days in some cases. And it's grandparents, great-grandparents, men and women, and children, toddlers, even infants have been murdered.
Boiled alive.
And using power tools on human beings while they're alive. So we're talking about demonic levels of hate, and this kind of hate doesn't come about by accident. This is the result of huge amount of conditioning and brainwashing.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so if we race through it again: classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination. Well, what on earth could come after that?
The final stage. The final stage is denial. And it is just as tragic as the preceding stages. After every genocide, denial occurs. The mass graves are destroyed, witnesses are intimidated or even eliminated, and historic files are eradicated and any evidence is extirpated. The initiators and leaders deny that any crimes were committed, and they continue to try and blame the victims for the atrocities. So due to their power, they impede any investigations until they are forcefully driven from power, because the only information comes from so-called unofficial sources, or the stories are considered alleged or ostensible. The leaders keep spreading propaganda of distorted statistics, and the actual definition of genocide is disputed. The number of killings is scrutinized as to whether it's considered a genocide or not. All these lives have been lost, and not one lesson is learned. And as evil tries to change and rewrite history, it is doomed to occur again, like we were saying earlier.
In fact, I immediately start thinking of Rwanda. I mean, that's one genocide I actually saw, witnessed, documented, interviewed many witnesses, went through over 1,000 pages of typed sworn statements and testimonies of survivors, and books that have been written on it. I wrote the Holocaust in Rwanda book, but then I read General Romeo Dallaere's book, Shake Hands with the Devil. Now, he was the Canadian general in charge of all UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda during the genocide. And he documents how they knew the genocide was coming. I mean, they'd seen these stages, they knew the stages, and he was warning the American president, Bill Clinton at the time, Warren Christopher's American Secretary of State, I think at the time, the General Secretary of the UN, that was his ultimate superior in the UN, and the man in charge of the Security Council at the time, who was Kofi Annan. And he has informed them from January 94 already about this genocide. And he planned, and he foolishly informed them that he was going to raid these warehouses where 1 million Chinese pangas or machetes had been stockpiled, brought in for the genocide.
Organization.
And next thing, he was forbidden to interfere and to go there. And he says the greatest regret of his life is that he didn't disobey orders, do what was right, and spend the rest of his life in prison for disobeying orders. But he then would at least have a clear conscience. But his conscience is tortured to this day. And he's written this book, and they've made an excellent film on it too, Shake Hands with the Devil, filmed in Rwanda, unlike the Hollywood Hotel Rwanda, which was filmed in South Africa with not a Rwandese in it, all South Africans and Americans playing Rwandese, which doesn't quite come off as believably as this incredibly honest, the British-made Shooting Dogs or Beyond the Gates, which is on just one case from a missionary perspective, a mission station where there were thousands of these Tutsi seeking protection and under the protection of the UN who were just abandoned, cheated. They were literally taken to hall for a meal, and while they were in there having the meal, the UN pulled out, and as they drove out the gates, in came the Interahamwe mass murderers who slaughtered them all, including the missionary who chose not to leave because he knew what they were doing. He said, well, I'm going to die with my people, I'm not leaving with you. And then we've also got the film Shake Hands with the Devil, based on General Romeo Dallaere's experience. But as he said, they knew about it. They knew it was coming. And so he puts at the end of the book these questions. Could the genocide have been anticipated? Yes, it was. Could we have stopped the genocide? Yes, we could. Could we have done more to save lives? Of course. And, I mean, basically, it's a terrible indictment on the US government, the UN administration, and do you know Kofi Annan, who was the man most responsible, who had forbidden them to do anything at any key time, didn't provide what was needed, even made sure that they abandoned the very refugees who were in the UN bases. And at the end, it took 10 years to get some admission of guilt from him. You know what his admission was finally 10 years after the genocide? The world failed you. The world. Not the UN, not me, not I failed you. The world failed you. Now, that's typical denial. They're not even willing to admit, couldn't even call it what it was. They were accessories to mass murder. They were accessories to genocide. And the best this creep could come out with is the world failed you. I mean, talk about passing the buck.
Yeah, absolutely.
So denial. We certainly saw that about Rwanda.
For sure. And we can see it happening in South Africa now even. Our police force has been ordered to stop collecting data and stop supplying the public with actual statistics. There have been more farm murders than, as we were saying earlier, in many wars, such as the Northern Ireland conflict in 1966 to 1998, and the Anglo-Iraqi War even in 1941. And that's just to mention a couple. So even though the crisis is dismissed and not considered a crisis or even a special crime, But yeah, farm attackers are found to be using military-grade arsenal unavailable to citizens, yet the government denies that they are premeditating the attacks or denies their involvement and denies the public truth and
Yes.
peace.
Now, we also need to remember that for over 300 years, the farmers in South Africa had a defense system called commandos. And this was
Correct.
voluntary, and it worked well. And the commandos basically kept the farmers safe for centuries. Frontier wars, cattle raiders, all sorts of things that happened, and they survived. The commandos were very effective. And then Thabo Mbeki, who was Mandela's handpicked successor, his vice president, who became president in 1999, he immediately disarmed and then demobilized the commandos and promised that there would be a special police unit that would specialize in protecting the farmers to take the place of the commandos, which of course never happened. So we've seen the farmers systematically stripped of their protections, and a lot of gun control, registration, ammunition's unavailable, this and the other. So many of the farmers found themselves, I mean, here's a farmer with maybe a revolver or a bolt-action rifle, and he's facing attackers who could be up to 12 people, sometimes with assault rifles and heavy military weaponry, and they're carrying on their backpack sometimes these cell phones, not scanners, blockers that can block cell phones. So when he's trying to phone out for help, that they're able to block it, which is a totally military grade thing. And
Sure,
that here they're facing military attacks. In quite a few cases, we know that the attackers, when the attackers have been killed or captured, turned out to be members of the South African National Defence Force, ex-ANC or ex-UPLA or ex-POCO terrorists, or members of National Intelligence Service, in some way involved with government. So there's a huge amount of, there's a big story waiting to be exposed of how many of the farm murderers and farm attackers actually are part of the state apparatus. And we have evidence that it includes not only South African military, but in many cases Lesotho as well. So there is a major scandal going on here, and they are denying this. And they even dismantled the special units. We used to have task forces dealing with gangs and dealing with vice and so on, and they've dismantled those on national level. So the South African Police Service doesn't have a designated task force of specialized police investigators dealing with farm murders or protection of the farmers, which would be even better. But they don't have either of those, do they?
No. So as we can see, the decentralized security systems worked much better, but those have been taken away so that this can happen, because as we can see, this has been organized for decades now. And it's also interesting because if we look at history, revolution often occurs in two stages. There's the initial stage, and then there's about a 20-year quietness, and then after that the second stage begins. And that's because in that stage the new generation can be brought up in deceit, because they can then be taught this hatred and just ingrained with this hatred, so that they can then carry out these genocidal massacres.
Yes, now if somebody wants examples of that, I get the Black Book of Communism, where it's clearly documented in 900 pages about the over 100 million people killed by communist regimes just in the Soviet Union and its other states. We're not even talking about Red China, because their files are still closed and not open for us. But because of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, we have the files of the KGB and so on open, and the Black Book of Communism, written by 6 ex-communists, including the editor of Communismo magazine, documenting by their own statistics 100 million people systematically murdered, and most of those in the second phase of the revolution. In the Soviet Union, the revolution was 1917. In 1936, about literally 19 years later, you had the Holodomor, the massacres of between 7 to 10 million Ukrainians in the breadbasket of Europe in the Holodomor. If anyone has not seen the film Bitter Harvest, I strongly recommend it. Bitter Harvest on the Ukrainian Holodomor. This is something most people don't even know about. But that was second phase of the revolution. In China, the main revolution was 1948. 1966 to 1968, You then had the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards, a whole new generation of kids who've been born free, who knew nothing about the reality before and who had nothing in them but Mao's Little Red Book and Mao's thoughts and Marxist slogans and indoctrination, and they went out and they killed something in the region of 60 million Chinese people in the second phase of the revolution. So this has happened in countries, and now you can think Zimbabwe. Mugabe came to power in 1980. In the year 2000, they started the second phase of the revolution, taking the white farms and so on, and it got worse and worse throughout the 80s. So yes, the second phase of the revolution is a reality, and what we're seeing in South Africa does seem to fit that bill. And there are communists and terrorists who speak about this is now the second phase of the revolution. We're entering the second phase of the revolution. Forget about the promises made in 1994 of a rainbow nation, of laws, colorblind, never, 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 never again will anybody be discriminated against on the basis of race, and this is a country of laws, and so on and so forth. And so all of those promises, that was just to bring up a whole new generation in hate and propaganda and race politics to be ready for the second phase of the revolution, which would be to eradicate the commercial farmers who have been feeding this country. We should bring out a few other stats. Like in 1994, we had 70,000 white commercial farmers. That's 1994. When Mandela took the oath of office and became president, 70,000 white commercial farmers, according to the Great South African Land Scandal, were feeding 100 million people throughout Africa. But our population was not even 28 million then. So we had 70,000 commercial farmers feeding 100 million people in 1994. Today, it's something closer to 28,000 commercial farmers who can not feed more than 40 million people, which is already an achievement.
Even less than 26,000, actually.
Probably less. And yet our population has doubled. We now have a 58 million population. Yeah. And so the situation is absolutely catastrophic, because what we're looking at is if they do this, like in the Soviet Union, like in China, when you go and wipe out, or they called it in Russia, dekulakization, getting rid of the kulaks, that was the word for the farmers, and getting rid of the whole class of commercial farmers, guaranteed famine. And of course, millions died of starvation. But as Joseph Stalin said, the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of a million is just a statistic. And he said, it doesn't matter if tens of millions of people die. It doesn't matter if half the population die, as long as the remaining half are communist. So you've got people who obviously don't care about the population, they don't care about justice, and they don't care about the land, and they don't care about food. They don't care about any of these things, do they? What they are after is their political ends. So we're dealing with something that's extremely vicious, and we've only actually looked now at the problem. But you've done another study, which is on resisting the genocide and the farmers who fight back, and there's some heartening statistics and facts that we will look at next week. But would you like to just say a few things about what you've found in that that we can expect to cover in our next program from the Frontline?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think that we need to be vigilant. We need to learn from history, and we need to look at the indicative warning signs, because none of the ideas and plans of our political leaders are new or revolutionary. They're simply stealing failed ideas from other Marxist rulers who starved their nations, like we've just said, and left their countries in decay. And the ANC even idolizes these criminals, as it's evident in their naming roads and buildings after these people, like Fidel Castro in Bloemfontein, named after the Cuban communist, and the Che Guevara Road in Durban, named after the militant Marxist, and also like
who massacred thousands of people,
including
women and children.
And even Mao Zedong, who we were just talking about now, they tried to name a road in Pretoria after him. So they are evidently expressing their ardor towards these dreadful murderers.
But they're Marxist icons and idols, obviously. It just shows what their orientation is.
Yeah, the government is misleading and manipulating poor and uninformed people who are living in rural areas by lying to them and making empty promises in order to acquire more votes in the upcoming elections. Yet every time, without fail, after the elections, these people will still be left in the townships. They'll still be left with empty promises and no food, and the politicians will be driving around in faster cars and have bigger mansions, and so we need to see who the real enemy is here.
We certainly do. So next week we're going to be looking at examples of resistance. We're going to be going into the other side of the story that is not being reported, which is that, and we've been amazed to find the statistic that when you read about, for example, over 10,000 farm attacks between 1994 and the year 2008, this is according to the Agricultural Union, out of which, of the 10,151 farm attacks between 1994 and 2008, there were 1,541 murders. Now that's absolutely atrocious. But notice, that means most of the attacks are failing. And while this isn't being reported very well, it would seem that most of the farmers, although outnumbered, although outgunned, although the attackers have the advantage of surprise in their hand, yet in most cases the farmers manage to fight off the attackers, sometimes with tremendous courage against all odds. And we've got some incredible testimonies of people, even grandmothers, even old people, and a mother who just gave birth, chasing away the farm attackers with the very axe that she is attacked with, taking this axe out of their hands. And so we'll get to some of the fighting back, because many people seem to think that the farmers are just sitting ducks. Well, of course, that's what the government wants them to be. But there's another story of resistance, and it would seem that in more cases than not, the farmers managed to turn the tables, save the day, and chase away the murderers without, or the attempted murderers, without suffering loss of life on their side. And so we do need to give this note of hope, and that'll be the main focus of next week as we go into resisting the genocide in South Africa.
Correct.
Any other things you would like to point out before we close?
I would just like to add that as South Africans, we have a duty, and this is to expose the evil that is going on. And Ephesians 5 verse 11 says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. So it's as clear as that. We need to try and spread this word and this truth as much as possible. And Ecclesiastes 18 verse 11 says, when the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, the hearts of the people are filled with schemes to do wrong. So as we can see, it's important to make sure that the crimes are paid for, and that we are exposing this evil. We need to ensure that we vote correctly as well, because Exodus 18 verse 21 says, select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials. So all the answers are right before us. We need to seek them and spread the good news. And yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for all the research you've done. So people can find these articles, like this 9 Stages of Genocide, on our Henry Morton Stanley School of Christian Journalism website and Facebook page. You can either on social media find Henry Morton Stanley School of Christian Journalism, or on the web it's HMS School of Christian Journalism, HMS for Henry Morton Stanley. So hmsschoolofchristianjournalism.org, you'll find articles on the 9 Stages of Genocide, the Farms and Freedom Under Fire in South Africa, and a whole lot more of uncensored news. Thank you, God bless, and good night.